Last time, all of our work was focused on the back of the painting, removing some of those planar distortions and relaxing some of those cracks out, and also addressing all of those, interesting approaches the artist took to creating the canvas, making sure that all of those seams that compose this patchwork quilt of various canvases were structurally sound, and so the painting would exist and last in the future. But now we can turn our attention to the artist's real focus, the painting, the image, the thing for which all of that work was done. Early on in the painting's examination process, I determined what type of varnish this was, and generally I would use a free solvent. That is, a little stick with some cotton rolled on it, dipped in the solvent, and then rolled over the surface to remove that varnish. But here, because the painting has so much impasto, texture, and built-up paint, I can't do that. It's not going to get into all those little nooks and crannies and pull out all that varnish. So I'm using a gelled version of the same solvent mixture. And that really is just a thicker gelled version. That's it. And I can paint it on the surface, allow it to sit there for 10, 15, 20 seconds, longer than would be possible with a free solvent because the free solvent will evaporate. And then I can come back with a cotton ball and lift off all of that gel that's been saturated with the old varnish. And as I do it, I can start to see little glimmers of color come through. Blues and pinks, oranges and reds, and it has me excited for what's in store. Well, working on her neck and her chest has revealed a really beautiful palette. Something that I'm really excited to see in her face. Because even dirty, you can start to see what the artist was trying to do. You can start to get little glimmers of some of those colors. And color is one of those things that artists are either really comfortable with or really uncomfortable with, and portrait painters specifically. It's really easy to use a lot of color in an abstract painting or a landscape, but on a portrait, how do you incorporate green and blue next to pink and orange on a face and have it make sense? Well, it takes talent and skill, a real understanding of color and temperature and how they can work together to move the eye through the space. And here, as I'm starting to clean off some of that old varnish, well, the mastery of the artist is starting to reveal itself. He or she was bold, using a full palette of color on the face. There are whites, creams, orange, pink, blue, even hints of green on her face. But they're not disparate chords. It's a symphony, all playing together in harmony to create one picture, one feeling, one image that works, even though individually it may not make sense. And nowhere is it better defined than on her eyes. Of course, she's going to have bright, blue, beautiful eyes. But look around her eyes, on her brow. There's yellow and green. There's turquoise, pink, orange, blue. It's just about every color, to say nothing of the browns and creams and other flesh tones. And they don't work as individual elements. Nobody has yellow eyebrows. But here they do. And maybe it's because her pose commands our attention, her grace, her poise, that we don't see these little colors, we just see her power. Maybe it's because the artist knew precisely what he or she was doing with color and how it would move us across the plane, in and out of two-dimensional space to give us the impression of 3 dimensions. Maybe both. But seeing it come alive, removing this yellow haze and seeing how they all work together, I tell you, I've been doing this for a long time. But paintings like this never, ever get boring. What does get boring or repetitive, exhausting, and maybe just generally frustrating is removing excessive and sloppy overpaint from paintings. This is just a constant in conservation, and it is what it is. So on the first pass, I used the gelled solvent to remove the obvious overpaint, and to my surprise, there is more overpaint. So again, I come with a gelled solvent, a slightly different one, to see if it works, and it really doesn't. This second overpaint, on top of which the first overpaint was applied, is really stubborn, which is probably why the second overpaint was applied, because that green just doesn't match. So I have to remove it mechanically. And in this case, I use a scalpel and I just very gingerly chip it off the surface. My hope is that it doesn't have a good bond, or it's bonded to a surface coating of grime or dirt, and that a little bit of force will release that. The tension will break that bond. Luckily, it does, and I'm able to remove all of that excessive green overpaint. But it reveals a small area of paint loss or damage, which was not unexpected. So I will coat it with this fill-in putty, and I'll start to let the putty dry. I need it a little bit stiffer than it is now, because I need to texture it. This painting has tons of impasto, and if I leave this smooth, well, everyone will see it. Maybe not from the front, but as they pass by the painting and the light hits it, they'll see the texture's wrong. So as the fill-in medium is stiffening up, I'll use a brush to just add some texture to it, and this will allow it to completely disappear. There are some other spots on the painting that I need to touch up with the fill-in medium, little chips here and there, but also on her face. These dark black cracks are disruptive, at least to me, and I want to make them go away. Her face is so striking, so powerful, that any little discrepancy, any little deviation, any distraction from that is a problem. It takes us out of that moment. So by filling them in and then removing the excess with my fingers, I've now created an area for the retouching paint to sit on and hopefully make all of those little cracks go away. As usual, I need to remove any of the excess fill-in medium from the painting surface. I don't want to cover up any original paint, and it's also just totally not necessary. So with a cotton swab and a little bit of water, I can run over the area and then just check it with my fingers to make sure it feels right. And now we can transfer the painting to another table and begin the stretching process. I chose to do the fill-in while the painting was flat because I had a nice hard surface to work on. I can certainly do it once the painting is stretched, but I didn't feel like stressing that canvas any more than was absolutely necessary. So just like that, the painting is now on a new 6-member keyable wooden support. The original support, while it once was a stretcher, it had been cut down, then expanded, and then all of the joints had been nailed and glued and secured with other pieces of wood. So it was rendered a strainer. It couldn't be keyed out and tension couldn't be kept on the painting, which is why some of those distortions and cracks manifest. This new support is much hardier, much stronger, and can be keyed out so we can keep proper tension on the canvas. Once I have secured the center of each edge, I will go along and just start tacking. I'm not using a ton of force here. I am using a pulling pliers, mostly just to get even force, but I don't want to overstress this canvas. It's primed on both sides. There is a ton of paint, so the amount of stretch that it has is really minimal, and I'm not expecting it to stretch like a new painting, or a thinly painted painting, or a painting on acrylic or cotton, which all factor into how much flexibility the painting has. In this case, it's pretty rigid, so I don't need to use a lot of force. I'm mainly just using the pulling plier to get even force and also to save my fingers from having to be worn down by grabbing and pulling all of this canvas. The magnetic hammer really makes this an easy process, almost as fast as using a pneumatic stapler. But of course, there's much more control, and staples are far, well, you know what they are. So with the painting all tacked down, I can start dealing with the back. I'm being very careful to lay the painting down on the surface of the table. And I'm not terribly concerned about the impasto because the edges are holding the painting and the rest of the canvas is deflecting in a little bit. So it's not like the impasto is getting crushed. I folded over the edge of the canvas and I'm tacking it down with some smaller tacks. This is just something that I do. I don't like cutting it and having it fray. I don't glue it down. Something that I learned from my father, and I've kept practice along because I just like the way it looks. Once it's all tacked down, I can then put the keys in. And these go into little mortises, and when I tap them down, you can see the stretcher expand. And that tiny little bit, that 1/32 of an inch, is enough to create tension on the canvas such that we're not going to get any distortions coming in the next several years. More tension may need to be added later on, but with keys we can do it. The keys are secured with some fishing line, cut, and then I can begin the retouching process. Now, luckily for me, on this painting, there is not a lot of retouching. In fact, there is very little retouching. But there is this big old gaping wound up in the background. And so I need to address that. Now, I don't use oil paint to retouch, and I don't use watercolor or acrylic. I use a paint in a synthetic resin vehicle. And that's different than oil because oil oxidizes and becomes permanent. And this synthetic resin can be reconstituted with solvents at a later time, making this paint fully reversible. This background looks really simple, right? Like it's a bluish, greenish, brownish, orangish, yellowish, bluish, grayish, whitish. Maybe it's not so simple after all. This is one of those cases where the artist mixed a lot of colors on the canvas. And so it's not a matter of making one color. It's a matter of making 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe more, and using them all together to create the overall color. It's much like how a newspaper uses a halftone to create a color. Lots of little dots of CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, work together to create colors that don't exist in that palette. And that's kind of the same thing here. So while it looks crazy that I'm adding green and purple and tan and red and periwinkle and whatever I'm adding, I'm trying to create a dither of colors that matches the colors in the background. And so as you step back, it will all blend together and your eye will see it as a complete area, not one of the colors. And it takes a bunch of passes. And even though I think I've gotten it pretty good here, I will come back later on and do a couple more passes to make sure that I've got it, well, perfect. In addition to dealing with that hole and some of the other areas of missing paint, I'm going to deal with those cracks now. Remember, I wanted these to disappear. I didn't want her face to be disrupted by those black lines. And so using my brush, I'm just very delicately applying paint onto that area of the crack. Just trying to cover up that white line, which was previously a black line, and cut right against her eye, and was really problematic, at least for me. Sometimes these things aren't visible when you see the painting in its dirty state, but only after the painting is clean can you see the big black line, and then you want to address them. Not always. If the painting is covered in cracks, maybe it's best to leave them, because once you do one, you have to do all of them. But on a painting like this, where there were just 2 or 3 that were really problematic, I see no reason why I shouldn't address them. And again, because this paint is reversible, if somebody really wants to see an unsightly crack through her face, they can remove the retouching and they can have the crack. Now, while I'm retouching, I noticed something that just didn't seem right, so I called Kit over to get a second opinion. The paint on her chest and her arm is really blotchy and uneven, and it strikes me as incorrect, and Kit seems to agree. We spent a little time talking about how it didn't really match her face and the sensitivity. And Kit asked if this was overpaint and retouching. And I didn't know. So I figured let's go and take a look at the painting under UV and see if we can learn anything. Now, reading a blacklight image can be complicated, and it's more art than science. Right off the bat, we can see the areas I've retouched as glowing dark purple, up there in the corner, and on her face, all of those cracks I retouched. That's clearly retouching. But the rest of her is also fluorescing. I mean, if we look at her arm, her shoulder, and on her chest, it's fluorescing bright green, which is not correct. Unless it is. As we look through the rest of the painting, we can see that the fluorescence continues really throughout it, and it's really well integrated with the image. It's essentially part of the image, and that's how we know that it's part of the original and not added at a later date. If we remove this, well, the painting would completely fall apart. And now, knowing that we don't have to do any more work on the painting, we can varnish it. And I've chosen to spray on the varnish because if I brush it on, the varnish will pool in all of those little nooks and crannies. And even though this varnish won't get yellow over time, if ever it needs to be removed, it's going to be so much more work than is necessary. Also, it may leave an unsightly appearance of pooled varnish on the painting. So I don't want to do that. Spraying it allows me to apply a thin, even coating across the entire surface without having to worry about leaving excess varnish in the nooks and crannies, in the voids, in all of that thick, heavy impasto. So a couple of passes each way, just making sure that I have a nice, even coating on the painting. And, well, that's it. It's all done. Well, there she is.
Mm-hmm. She's really lovely.
She is.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of don't know what to expect when you go into a project like this, and you have these great expectations and hopes, and sometimes it lives up to that, sometimes it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
I I think this one lived up to it. I'm still a little conflicted about it.
I have so many questions still.
Yeah, I think that's the really fun thing, is that even though we've done a lot of work on it, it's been cleaned, the stabilization of the seams, taking off the overpaint and doing the retouching, all that kind of stuff was kind of necessary and went according to plan and was really successful, and I think has improved the painting. There are so many questions, but at its basic, I think it looks really, really good. I'm really, really happy with how her skin, her shoulders, her neck, all cleaned up, and how the light and movement kind of carries you through. Kind of the stuff that we saw in the beginning, just kind of amplified now.
It's not quite what I wanted it to be, but I'm really content.
What did you want it to be?
Well, I mean, you can't really discern. I mean, you have a general idea when you're looking at old varnish. You can kind of see the depth of color a little bit. I thought it was going to be more vibrant than it is, and just like very post-impressionist, kind of just bright yellows or something. But
some of that does come through, like in her skin tones. Those are really dramatic reveals.
Yeah.
But I mean, me too. When I was cleaning the dress, I thought it was going to be, instead of brown to yellow, I thought it was going to be bright white, or just like glittery, bright, gorgeous painting. And some of the initial tests I did kind of revealed that. So I guess, I'm not disappointed with how it cleaned up, but I guess part of me is always hoping for like a blockbuster, explosion transformation. But I think it still made a huge difference.
Yeah, it is still a terrific painting.
Well, let's take a look at the back, because even though the front is the important stuff, there was a lot of work done on the back, and it made a big difference. Yep.
Every time I see it, it's just
bonkers.
It's crazy. Like all the nail holes and from the tabs.
Yeah. Like this really composed, really complete, really well executed portrait, and on the back, chaos.
Yeah.
It's just like,
there's just like random little bridges of different canvas everywhere.
I mean, multiple different types of canvas, different weaves. It's stitched, it's glued, it's patchworked. Keeping the seams was paramount.
And then fortifying them.
And fortifying them, right. Because they do tell a story of this artist's work. Cobbling together all of these pieces of canvas from different paintings and stuff. To hide all of that I don't think it would take away from the painting itself, from the image, but it takes away from the object and the craft of it. And so ultimately that's why I decided just to do a reinforcement of these seams to make sure that they were as strong as possible, but we could also still see them, because I didn't want to cover them up. Because hopefully someday in the future, when somebody does take it off the wall and turn it around, they'll have the same reaction that we did.
Yeah.
What in the world is going on here?
Yeah. I want them to put it on a glass wall so that you can see the back of it, because it is just as cool as the front of the painting. I mean, it's not as, it's pretty painterly, if we're being honest, of like scrapping material together.
Yeah, I see what you did there.
Yeah, but yeah, it's just, it's really cool.
All right, Kate, well, you know who is waiting to see, so let's get out of here.